Հայաստանի կառավարությունը ռազմական դրություն հայտարարեց սեպտեմբերի 27-ին։ Ռազմական դրության վերաբերյալ որոշմամբ Հայաստանի ամբողջ տարածքով միջոցառումների, իրավունքների եւ ազատությունների սահմանափակումներ հաստատվեցին։ Սահմանափակումներից մեկը վերաբերում էր հանրային հրապարակումներին եւ հաղորդումներին։ Սեպտեմբերի 27-ին հայտարարված սահմանափակումներն ավելի խստացվեցին հոկտեմբերի 8-ին։ Նոր փոփոխություններով սահմանվեց, որ պետական անվտանգության առնչվող գործողությունները քննադատող, հերքող, դրանց արդյունավետությունը կասկածի տակ դնող կամ որևէ կերպ արժեզրկող հաղորդումները արգելված է հրապարակել։ Պատերազմական պայմաններում խոսքի ազատության մասին զրուցելու ենք DFRLab-ի խմբագիր Zarine Kharaziani հետ։ So we're starting with an amendment to the martial law that has been announced in Armenia on September 27, and the amendment is from October 8th. Propaganda against the defense capacity and security of Republic of Armenia and Artsakh, including the publications questioning the defense capacity of Armenia and Artsakh, is prohibited. What do you think? How this has changed the course of the war?
I think during wartime, it makes sense that for matters of national security, there are additional restrictions that we may not have in place during peace. But the question, I think it's still worth considering, the freedom of speech violations of extending martial law and the ensuing free speech restrictions, especially on journalists and the freedom of information and access to information.
But on the other hand, yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say also there can be a tendency, including in Armenia, to politicize disinformation and to use the specter of disinformation to go after political opponents. And that is something that we see in more autocratic countries, but it is also something that we see in democracies that do not have necessarily strong enough institutions to withstand that. And when that is the case, then it becomes a concern that something like that can develop into a broader assault on free speech and liberties.
Zarine, just to compare, did we see the same in Azerbaijan?
In Azerbaijan, the situation is different. I think in Armenia, there is an overabundance and diversity of various media sources, with some of them with opaque political affiliations, but it creates a situation when there's an overabundance of essentially media, but the media is is deeply polarized along partisan lines. In Azerbaijan, the government has the power to exert stricter control because they don't have the free speech protections in place that Armenia has. So I think they are different models, but I think there are certain concerns regarding freedom of speech restrictions during wartime in Armenia as well that we are seeing play out.
Although the martial law is still on, but what I see, it doesn't work properly. I mean, there are these limitations, but they do not work as they were supposed to work. Although we know cases when police kind of try to questioning people who publish something they do not like. And the question is, don't you think that the mood of people on November 9, I mean, how upset they are about the results of the war, kind of connected to the wartime propaganda they eyewitnessed for more than 40 days?
I definitely think it is connected, and I think the tendency early on in the war to stress a reliance on official sources only ultimately limited journalists' ability to communicate to the public. And as a result, what was happening on the ground did not necessarily match with the expectation of the public according to the reporting that they were getting. What I think is sort of paradoxical is that the situation arose from, usually these situations happen in countries where there's a lack of trust in government. And I think in this case, there was outsized trust in government. And as a result, now we are seeing the repercussions of that.
Do you think the government still has the trust? I mean, the information which comes from the government?
I think there needs to be a sort of reckoning in the way that, first of all, strategic comms on the communications on the Armenian side from the government and how the government communicates information to the people needs to be revisited. And I think we have seen a sort of failure of the model of direct communication with the people from the government while cutting out intermediaries, which are usually the media and journalists. And I think that relationship needs to be reestablished in the Armenian media environment.
Also, what is quite noteworthy and should be mentioned is quite tough censorship from the audience itself. Maybe you remember the only case when one of the Armenian journalists decided to speak publicly about the real situation on the front line and what kind of confrontation he faced.
Yes, that also has been troubling to see. I think, again, while the claim that under wartime there need to be some restrictions in place for what people can and can't say, I think when you start limiting the ability of journalists, especially to express themselves, then you're creating larger problems down the line.
However, although all these restrictions, there were a lot of disinformation on the Armenian media, especially social media. Do you have any observations? Which one is your favorite fake so far?
One of my favorite fakes was that there was a Wagner soldier, Wagner mercenary in Armenia that was actually from, I believe, a Serbian. He was an actor from a movie that circulated and was debunked quite swiftly. I would say that is my favorite. A lot of what I think we have seen is sort of tactical disinformation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, mostly focused on exploiting the fog of war and the fact that very few journalists actually had access to the front lines, especially local journalists in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And as a result, we had very little information about what was going on. And then
but there were a lot of international journalists who working on the scene.
There were definitely a lot of international journalists, but I think, for example, a lot of the reporting on what was happening battle to battle, for example, was coming out of Telegram channels and not necessarily undergoing verification or adhering to journalistic standards. So while the international media was reporting on the shelling of Stepanakert and the sort of the broader, larger inflection points of the war, there was very little reporting on actually what was going on in the ground in the moment, except from these unverified channels over social media that are able to spread quite quickly without additional verification.
Well, especially in this kind of critical situation, people kind of intend to believe in whatever they have been told, even if that's a disinformation, and they intend more to disseminate, share widely the information they got, even if it's a fake news. Maybe we have some kind of advices for people in this critical situation, in this kind of critical situations, how to consume the media.
Yes, I think the general advice, well, I think first of all, the blame for this never should lie with the public. I think first it is the job of the government and of political institutions to communicate quickly and efficiently with the public and with the media. But I do think in terms of what the public can do, I think just the increasing recognition that emotions are high, and especially during wartime, there's a lot of really traumatic and graphic imagery circulating and a lot of traumatic, unverified information, and a recognition that anything emotional should, before sharing something that, you know, provokes a sort of emotional reaction, people should take a breath and think about what will have the consequences of essentially putting that information out further into the ether. I have had that experience myself when I've seen something that has, in the context of monitoring the war, that has that I've impulsively wanted to share because it has elicited some sort of reaction from me. But then when I took a breath to pause before sharing, I decided not to. And I think just that's one very little information hygiene practice that if it's practiced at scale, can influence the spread of disinformation in wartime.
So we have seen two completely different realities in Armenia and Azerbaijan. One quite open regarding to the media and social media especially, and the second one is under completely restrictions and even banned social media for quite a long period of time. What can we say here? Which of those were right actually?
They were both wrong. They are, I think they are both examples of how disinformation and information control can negatively affect democratic discourse in two very different societies. One that is more open, but still has weak political institutions, opportunities for corruption and things like that. And another that exacts very strict information control over their domestic information environment and punishes activists and journalists.
But
Actually, I see them as two foils of the same they're like reverse mirror images of each other in a way. I think the media environment that we saw in Armenia versus Azerbaijan.
And you believe both were wrong?
Yes, I think in a sense. I mean, I think the Azerbaijani model of information control is maybe effective in the short term in shoring up. If you win a war, it can be effective in shoring up popular support, but ultimately jailing journalists and harassing all, you know, anti-war activists is not a way to build a free and fair democratic society in the long term.
And banning international media.
Exactly.
From working on the scene. Zarine, the only case when Armenia tried to control social media when they banned TikTok in the country. What do you think? Was this the right decision?
I think that was a knee-jerk reaction. We had a very similar discussion here in the US about banning TikTok from the Trump administration. I think a general feeling around many from a lot of digital security practitioners is that yes, TikTok presents some security risks, but when you think about the security risks that social media users expose themselves anyway from having, you know, Facebook and all these other social media platforms that essentially collect their data in a lot of cases rather indiscriminately. I think the ban on TikTok may be more geopolitically motivated than based on the sort of you know, technical security.
You mean in the US?
In Armenia as well. I would say the same. I think if, for example, I don't know, Telegram was banned just because it was Russian, I would say that as well was primarily geopolitically motivated rather than motivated by legitimate security concerns.
Anyway, we are speaking about social media ban in Azerbaijan, but there were quite a lot of accounts, a lot of people propagating their ideas and the Azerbaijani side of the perception of the conflict. Who were these people?
I think, well, one thing is, I think on the Armenian side, we forgot that Azerbaijan also has a diaspora. It may not be as vocal as and committed as the Armenian diaspora in some cases, but I do think a lot of the, at least a lot of the accounts I saw being mobilized appeared to be coming from actually outside of Azerbaijan. The other thing is that there was so as social media was blocked in the country and people started downloading VPNs, there was one of the government sponsored disinformation narratives was that VPNs are unsafe and that several of the more popular VPN services are actually Armenian in origin. And that was intended to prevent Azerbaijanis from actually downloading VPNs and having access to information when the government was restricting information flow. But so I think a lot of it was, there's a perception that these campaigns were like on Twitter were state organized and sponsored. It didn't seem that way to me. It seemed mostly coordinated activism on the part of the Azerbaijani diaspora and Azerbaijanis, mostly a lot of young people from within Azerbaijan that were just using VPNs and therefore able to get around the internet restrictions.
On the Armenian side, there were a lot of activists too who were kind of cooperating on propagating their ideas. Do you think they succeed quite enough?
It depends. I think those campaigns essentially serve as a signal boost, as a rather low quality signal boost, because what they do, for example, is maybe you coordinate with a bunch of people online to go and like a particular article that expresses a vaguely pro-Armenian perspective that was published. And then if people come across it, maybe it gives that article an initial signal boost, but anyone that then looks at the accounts liking it and then sees this pattern across multiple cases notices that there's either there's some sort of inauthentic activity going on, and the engagement seems to be low quality, even if there are no, even if it's not necessarily a bot army doing that work, but it's real people using their real accounts. It can still serve as an initial signal boost, but beyond that, not really have much of an effect on what is being reported on the conflict. And I think that is primarily what we saw. And I think that is, I think in this iteration of the war, that was mobilized more on the Armenian side than the Azerbaijani side, probably because the Armenian diaspora is more, connected and cohesive.
So I wonder what DFRLab have done about monitoring the wartime propaganda in Armenia and Azerbaijan, or the conflict itself, the coverage of the conflict.
Sure. Most of what we've focused on so far that we've published is conflict and security reporting. There has been a tremendous, modern wars like this generate a tremendous amount of unverified footage that spreads very quickly on social media, and verification of that footage often provides better grounds for documentation of human rights abuses down the line. So most of our reporting thus far has focused on that. We've covered the execution in Hadrut of Armenian POWs, as well as the environmental destruction from white phosphorus, alleged reported white phosphorus use on the forests of Artsakh. And we're also monitoring the broader disinformation narratives in the conflict. That includes the more tactical.
Can we mention some of them?
Sure. I think there are essentially two layers. There's some of the tactical stuff going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which has since died down a bit since the ceasefire. That is mostly focused on exploiting the fog of war. For example, circulating, for example, images of Russian PMCs in Armenia without any reports suggesting that, as well as premature declarations of victory or things that are intended to depress morale in the other side, is something we saw a lot. But then more broadly, there's also been a clear geopolitical narrative battle being waged between Russia and Turkey. And sometimes it's contradictory, and sometimes these messages are mutually reinforcing. From pro-Kremlin outlets primarily, we've seen a duality. Russian state media has primarily reported rather objectively, mostly based on just official statements from Azerbaijani and Armenian government officials. Sometimes they may selectively emphasize one over the other, but it's been pretty even. However, there's this whole ecosystem of Russian conspiracy outlets, and some of them, for example, have been tied before to Russian security services. One of them that publishes mostly in English is South Front. And these outlets have been primarily posting about how Nikol Pashinyan was a puppet of the West. He came to power because of a Western-backed coup, and he lost Karabakh on purpose in order to sever Armenia's relations with Russia and put Armenia on a path to Euro-Atlantic integration. And so that has been the main thing that I have seen.
Zarine, what about visual content? I mean, there were dozens of photos, especially capturing allegedly rockets landed at civilian areas. And the Armenian side would not believe in photos published by the Azerbaijani side, and the same was vice versa. And people have been making memes on these photos and making fun of those photos. Have you been able to check at least some of these photos to find out whether they're real or not?
Yes, so we have verified, for example, instances of cluster munitions use on Stepanakert, and some of the videos circulating around that, and as well as some international organizations have also done that. In terms of, there have been some instances of imagery that do not seem, that appear staged, but it can be sort of hard to tell a lot of the time without sufficient detail. For example, two of our security researchers who specialize in conflict and security reporting are more able to do that than, for example, I am, or that a layperson is. But there have been both real and a lot of miscontextualized photos circulating, definitely. Especially following the wreckage in Ganja, there were a lot of fake imagery circulating. There was also a lot of legitimate imagery that was denounced as fake or Azerbaijani propaganda, when in fact it did appear that it was real.
To conclude, ordinary users, Facebook users, Twitter account holders, what they should do when they got this kind of images on their feed? How do they can check this information, or they just have to believe in it or not?
I think the first step that people can take is to conduct a reverse image search, which is quite simple. You can do that through you can download an image and then drag it into Google's image search interface, and it will show you results of that image. And that's one way to very quickly identify imagery that has previously circulated, because most fake imagery that we see is not doctored using any sophisticated techniques. It's just imagery from somewhere else in the world, or that maybe circulated earlier but is not from this iteration of the conflict, that has been miscontextualized essentially.
At the end, just to conclude, maybe you have something to add.
My number one advice would be to follow local journalists who are experienced disinformation reporters and fact checkers. I think in Armenia, especially, something that has been very heartening is how vibrant the media and fact checking beat is, and there are a lot of media organizations doing great work in that field. FIP, Media.am, HETK, EVN Report. So that would be my first suggestion to anybody looking for accurate information.
Zarine, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us. DigiBoost video podcast-երի շարքը պատրաստում է Digital Communication Network Հայաստանը, Նիդերլանդների VVD հիմնադրամի աջակցությամբ։ Podcast-երի այս շարքում քննարկում ենք մեդիային առնչվող հարցեր։ Այս էպիզոդում այսքանն էր։ Զրուցեցինք պատերազմի ընթացքում տեղեկատվական սահմանափակումների մասին։ Հաջողություն ձեզ։